Hi there, Frank Winston here from the Pacifica Historical Society and host of the show Footprints of Pacifica, where we explore and discover some of the lure and the lore of lovely Pacifica, its character and its characters. The focus of this show will be on the Ocean Shore Railroad, which ran from San Francisco along the coastside from 1905 to 1921. And we're going to look at some video of some people who actually rode the railroad and can describe it to us. And then we'll be meeting with Chris Hunter, who wrote the authoritative book on the Ocean Shore Railroad. Let's have the tape, please.
As a child, my first acquaintance with the Ocean Shore Railroad as a means of access to the coast came when, as a member of the St. Mary's Choir, my brother and I took part in an excursion, and we went into town. At that time, it was quite an excursion to get from 32nd Avenue into 12th and Harrison, and where the train depot was located. And that was a 40-minute ride in itself. But once on the train, why, it was an experience to go down the coast and to see the land disappear on the seaward side, and the cliffs keep us company all the way down, until we came to a place where something happened and the land fell away on both sides, and we were suspended in midair and traveling across what I later found out was a trestle. And then we would reach the other side of the trestle and again come back onto the cliffside and the ocean view, and on the way down to our first stop would be at the Thornton Station, or subsequent stations along the way, picking up passengers and produce, and the memorable occasion that I am referring to was when we stopped at that lagoon. The Laguna Salada was named after a lagoon, an arm of the sea that came in and covered a good part of what is now the golf course. But down to the lagoon, they placed a bathing pavilion. Decks reached out into the water, and bathhouses covered the whole area, and many people took advantage of it, and among them were the boys from San Francisco. Way from Christmas, I come back to Dixie, so my pockets are empty, and my heart is full of pain. I'm 1,000 miles away from home, just waiting for a train. It was hoped that they would combine the freight and passenger service, not only holiday excursions on the weekend, but that with the building up at the coast and the development of homes, it would provide a regular, almost a commuting service. That was in the future. The 1906 earthquake made many people believe that there would be an influx of dwellers from the city who would come down and live in what to them would be a safer place, however they considered to be a safer place. But there were three sources of income then to the railroad prospectively. First of all, the establishment of a commuter train that would eventually carry them all the way down to Santa Cruz, and that would be a very lucrative business. It would serve the communities along the coastside and assist in the development of those communities. At the same time, too, remember the produce from the county or the farms along the coast were all taken in by horse and wagon to the centers of population, mainly San Francisco. And that was quite a haul over the roads that then existed over the Coast Range Mountains.
I understand you rode on it?
I rode on it. I remember one particular time with my mom and dad, and that was a precarious trip, right alongside the ocean, you know. You could just get devastated by just looking down because it was right on the cliff there. I remember it's going through town, Salada Beach, near Mr. Lawson's grocery store, and just childish memories.
Some of the problems were that faced the ocean shore developers in building a railroad along the cliffs and down, projected to Santa Cruz. The right-of-way was continually subjected to erosion, in some years worse than others. And while it was a spectacular ride, to us it was enjoyable, but it was a headache to those who were operating the right-of-way and had gone to considerable expense to bore tunnels, build trestles, and bring everyone to the place where the train ended at Tunitas Canyon. Since the Ocean Shore Railroad ended at Tunitas, a bus would take people on the remainder of the trip down to a place near Davenport where they could take a train and go on into Santa Cruz.
Good. Train now departing.
The number of people using the road was more or less unpredictable. It depended upon those who came to use the several areas of the place for picnics. People in those days were very dependent on public transportation. The automobile had not arrived. And the thing to do was to board a train and go into Marin County to the well-known picnic areas up there, or down the coast to the picnic areas that were located in the canyons along through Sharp Park and to the well-known spots called Rockaway Beach and San Pedro Beach and points south. Sometimes there weren't enough passenger cars that were completely enclosed, and flat cars were pressed into service and benches were placed on them, suitably fastened, so that people could get on there and enjoy and ride in the open air. It was a good idea to be protected on the way home very often because you were exposed to the weather more or less. But then to have their good times, people were pretty well content to put up with whatever hardships, we would call them hardships, but at that time they were the things that you encountered in the ordinary course of events. About the railroad itself, of course, we're familiar with the fact that there was a station at Sharp Park, Laguna Salada, or Salada Beach, and then at Rockaway, then at the in San Pedro Valley, out on the road that led around past Shelter Cove and along the outer edge of Devil's Slide, and the next station would be down at Princeton and points south. When a franchise is granted to a railroad, it does not include only the right-of-way itself, but for a certain distance on each side of the right-of-way, land is granted to the railroad management as partly an inducement for them to bring transportation to outlying areas, and partly as a matter of maintenance for them to have a place to establish the needed railroad yards and storage places and so forth. And so when the Southern Pacific regarded the ocean shore as a possible threat to their almost exclusive operations along the peninsula, they put a spur track across the existing right-of-way of the ocean shore at a place where I would say was near Davenport, where the cement plant is located. And litigation over that lasted many years. and it was compounded by the fact that the right-of-way gave them continual trouble. In fact, in 1919, they had a serious, which proved to be a disastrous slide along the area from between Thornton Station and Muscle Rock. At the same time, the employees of the railroad chose to go on strike. The war had just ended, that is the First World War, and it was not a good time for them to do it, coupled with the fact that the operating troubles were of such a vexatious nature. But it caused the management to face up to the fact that the railroad was not going to be profitable, and the Ocean Shore as a railroad ceased to exist. But the real estate that they owned for years was operated under the title of the Ocean Shore Land Company. And as recently as when we were building the Pacific Manor School, a certain amount of difficulty was encountered because the projected building would encroach on the lands of the Ocean Shore Railroad, the Ocean Shore Land Company. And through the years, all those difficulties have been gradually resolved, and we now have Highway 1 following generally the course of the railroad, and that's the situation as it exists today.
With us in the studio for this show is Chris Hunter, the editor and publisher of the Pacifica Tribune and the author of one of the authoritative books on the history of and the color of the Ocean Shore Railroad. And Chris, how did you come about to write this particular book?
Well, when I first learned about the Ocean Shore Railroad when I came to Pacifica in 1990, I was fascinated by the existing berms and the idea that there had been a little railroad that had come down the coast and that there was a little tunnel in Pedro Point that had been closed off. And so the background of it inspires you, and there's a couple of very interesting books that have been written through the years. And I was able to start writing stories in the Pacifica Tribune, which is the community newspaper here in Pacifica, with the help of the Historical Society and some other people who had pictures and stories. And so I would be writing stories in the newspaper through the years, and then covering events from the Historical Society and learning more about it.
And then you compiled them into the book with...
Well, and then I was fortunate in meeting two young men, twins, the Vargas brothers, who make models of trains, and they are brilliant model makers. And they had done some models of the Ocean Shore Railroad, and they had enabled them to get a hold of a lot of photographs. Now, the really interesting thing about this and the video that we just saw is a great, I mean, Bob Siebert did a great job of explaining the whole history of it. Sure. And but there aren't that many pictures, and so they're the same pictures that people see all the time. And when I was researching for this book, I was just praying that somebody who had taken a picture had sort of turned the camera out to the ocean at one
and saw some of the views,
or taken some more pictures instead of being so enamored of the train itself. Mm-hmm. So there are very few images that show how beautiful and the reason the train existed.
Okay, when you did the book, you involved interviews with people as well, or was it had ridden the railroad?
Well, just the handful of people that had already been interviewed. I mean, it's the same stories, and I just researched it through the Historical Society.
Well, take us back to 1905, when you can start with the story of the railroad, of this particular vision of the railroad.
Well, in 1905, a group of investors got together and decided that they would mimic some of the other railroads, famous railroads throughout America, some of them going down the peninsula, others in New York, for example, going out to Long Island. And the idea was if they could get a train, a dependable train that went from downtown San Francisco out to the coast and then down all the way to Santa Cruz, that they could develop all of the land in between and people could live there and commute into San Francisco or into Santa Cruz.
Chris, were they doing this for the potential public who could commute, or did they have an ulterior motive?
Well, the idea was that they were going to make a lot of money, but then most transportation systems try to make some money. And this particular transportation system was a private one. So they were selling stock, and they were hoping to sell land along the railroad to create and expand some of the small communities that were already existing there.
Well, if they started in 1905 with developing it, and they'd raised some money, 1906 probably interfered.
Well, a very, very bad thing happened in San Francisco, the earthquake that devastated the city, and then the fire devastated, and then all of the Ocean Shore Railroad rolling stock just happened to have been built all the way out to Daly City and was on the cliff, the side of the hills there, and it fell into the ocean. And so they lost a tremendous amount of value, and then they had to work on helping move some of the destroyed parts of San Francisco in and out. And there was still a goal. The goal was if they came back and built the railroad, that all of the people who were afraid of San Francisco would build homes along the coast.
And they were afraid because of the earthquake and fire.
But what happened was that people in San Francisco weren't afraid. They just rebuilt San Francisco. And so they didn't say, well, let's move out of San Francisco. They said, let's rebuild San Francisco. And that's one thing that hurt the Ocean Shore. The other thing was the difficulty in building a stable ledge for the railroad along the Devil's Slide area.
Well, when they built from San Francisco, for our viewers, whereabouts in San Francisco? Because you've described a little bit about the ocean, and we can parallel that.
Basically from 12th and Mission and out where Bayshore is now, Bayshore all the way across where the Alamany highway is, the Alamany Road.
So it came through Daly City after it left San Francisco?
And then it came through Daly City basically out John Daly Boulevard all the way to the coast. And then it began its perilous adventure along the coast for picturesque reasons, and then the difficulty of building the ledge along the coast. And then it came into Pacifica.
Well, which was not Pacifica at the time.
At the time, it was not Pacifica.
So what were some of the areas of what is now Pacifica where there actually were railroad stations?
Well, one of the very first ones in the north end of town is where what was called the Pacific Manor School, and it was mentioned, Bob Siebert mentioned it, and then that school is now called Ocean Shore. There was a small railroad station there. There's a real estate company that's there at the corner of Oceana. And then basically the railroad went along Oceana to in front of where Oceana High School is now, and then an old building.
What'd you say in front of Oceana? That Oceana's high on a hill. You're talking about
down on Oceana Boulevard. Okay. What's Oceana? There was a railroad station there too, and then it kept going on further south, and there's a restaurant that's the best looking Ocean Shore Railroad station is the Ash's Valimar Station restaurant. And the train was right in front of that. And then so it basically went along the route of Highway 1 now to Rockaway, to the corner of Fassler and Highway 1. And there was another station there, a Rockaway station in that area. But then the train tracks veered off west because they couldn't place the railroad tracks up over that very high hill there. And so that it veered to the west and went around what's called the Rockaway Headlands. And to this day, you can see the ledge around the Rockaway Headlands where the train track went. And then it went along the beach, which is now Lindemar Beach, up to Pedro Point. And you can still see the ledge along Pedro Point. And then there's another station there that's a private home now.
Let me ask about the people using it, either commuters from San Francisco or tourists on the weekend to the beaches and the bathhouses he talked about. How often did the railroad run?
Well, they were seriously trying to get it to run as regularly as possible for commuters and for tourists. And so it had early morning and late evening runs, and then excursion runs through the day for picnickers. I mean, and it described very well in Bob's recollections of it. The idea was that you wanted to have a consistent commuting train for people who lived south of San Francisco on the coast who could get to work, but then also an excursion train. And ultimately, the excursion is what was most successful during that period. As I said, they had to put benches on the railroad tracks so that people see on the train, so people could enjoy it.
Well, talk about south of Pacifica now. The goal was to get all the way to Santa Cruz. It would be popular up and down the coast. Never made it to Santa Cruz.
Right.
And there was that grasp of the section there, the 28 miles that they had to go by bus or some other matter. By what they did before, there was automobiles. I don't know what they did from Santa Cruz up towards Half Moon Bay.
Well, from The railroad actually went all the way to what's called the Tunitas Station, which is the last station south of Half Moon Bay, was Half Moon Bay now. And then there was a 26 to 28 mile gap that they had, and then they had the train that came, the train tracks were laid from Swanton all the way to Santa Cruz. And so it's really interesting that the most difficult part was in Pacifica along the Rockaway headlands and the San Pedro headlands, and they had to build a small tunnel. And then currently Devil's Slide, even today in 2006, we're having the same problems with Devil's Slide that they had in 1900s. But then there was a Stanley Steamer train, Stanley Steamer cars that were part of the Ocean Shore, where people would get off the train, get on a car, and be taken to the next stop 26 miles south, get on another train to be able to go all the way to Santa Cruz.
But those people weren't going to Santa Cruz for the resort time. They were
Sometimes they were.
Really?
I mean, Santa Cruz was a very popular destination. In fact, a much bigger resort area than anything in between San Francisco and Santa Cruz.
Well, the investment company that originated this, they folded and went out of business, but they had problems almost like you would have today if you built a railroad. The Municipal Railway in San Francisco, Southern Pacific, Wells Fargo, all of those are in competition for the Wells Fargo Express. They didn't like the idea of this interloper railroad.
Well, there's a lot of history about that, and there's actually been a book recently that says that Southern Pacific has gotten a lot of bad press that it doesn't deserve. But when you read about the Ocean Shore, it's real clear that the big railroad companies didn't want little interloper railroad companies being created. And as Bob said in his recollections, they actually put a spur right across the railroad in the Santa Cruz area that kept it from building a bigger station. They had a tiny station for the Ocean Shore in Santa Cruz that ultimately was part of the failure, that they couldn't get the consistency. The other thing is just nature fought against them. And then the other thing is that around that time, in the late teens, the automobile started becoming more popular. They opened a road over Montero Mountain. People could come down and come and go as they please. And also the idea of having produce being pulled on the train, trucks could take produce easier, more efficiently than the train could at that time too. So there was a lot of things working against the Ocean Shore at that time in history. It was a little ahead of its time, because now all we are is talking about mass transportation, public transportation, getting more people onto a train or a light rail.
What kind of produce were they hauling back and forth?
Well, San Mateo County was at one time the world's largest producer of artichokes. And all of the lush valleys up and down San Mateo, including Pacifica, the Lindamar Valley, were just full of artichokes.
Tell me in a word about El Granada, because that was sort of one of the more picturesque locations.
Well, El Granada was designed by Daniel Burnham, who was one of the most famous architects in America at the time, who was involved in a great many projects from Washington, D.C. to the World's Fair in the late 1890s. And he designed a concentric circle, half-circle town that would be a showpiece. And, of course, it never really materialized, but people today can see in El Granada those concentric circle streets there.
Well, they also had an idea of building hotels, major hotels for resorts and the like. A couple were actually built down towards Santa Cruz, and then in recent times we've just added some hotels, Half Moon Bay and the like, but most of the hotels never developed on the coast.
Well, there's nothing unusual about wanting a resort hotel along a beach anywhere in the world. The idea was that they wanted to try to apply that along the San Mateo County coast, forgetting that it's often foggy and cold. So it's not the same thing as putting the Coronado in San Diego or some of the LA resorts. But there was the idea that people would come for a resort if it was built. And today we're seeing the same thing happen now. There's a Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay, which is a very large resort. So that same mentality they wanted in the early 1900s.
Well, Chris, we're just about out of time. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience that was spectacular in your research?
Well, one of the things that he talked about, the easements of the Ocean Shore. Just recently, there was a court case between the public school district, at the time Laguna Salada, now it's called Pacifica School District, and some heirs of the Ocean Shore Railroad easements to get $250,000 the school district had to pay to be able to modernize what was Pacific Manor, but is now Ocean Shore, because the easement went right through the middle of the playground.
So even though there's no longer a railroad running, there's still the remnants of it historically, economically, politically, and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was probably the last major effect, but there's still a lot of easements that are collecting sales tax and paying sales tax. But the thing with the school district was the most interesting recent example.
Pacifica build many homes, or because there still are not that many homes in Pacifica to its potential because of either the no growth attitude or the like. But there certainly were more than was intended at the time.
Well, the Ocean Shore Railroad had intended a great many homes with a lot of small lots, and those small lots ended up being dogging the planning development of Pacifica because they were too small for current standards. So some of them had to be combined, especially in Pedro Point, where they were 25-foot wide, and that's not a legal lot. And so the theory was that there was going to be a tremendous amount of development from the early days. And then when the Ocean Shore Railroad didn't develop, we have 40,000 people in Pacifica, but in 1957, the theory was it would be 90,000, which is similar to what the Ocean Shore wanted.
Well, I have to thank you, Chris. I'm pleased to thank you because you've shared with us some of the highlights of the history, which is what the Pacifica Historical Association likes to promote. And we want to thank also the Society, and there should be a place where you can contact the Society for membership, volunteering, bringing us some of your memorabilia. That's another thing. You were able to collect or research with some of the things 100 years old. We hope to do that and have people now give us things, because people like you, Chris Hunter, wouldn't have as much trouble finding some of the old photographs. And that brings us to a close, and I want to thank the audience. And remember, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and, departing, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time.